Have you started it, Dana?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm not seeing the video.
There's a delay. That's why there's the 30 seconds.
Hello and welcome to Adulting 101, Roommates and the Art of Compromise. I have three special guests with me today. I'm going to go around and let them introduce themselves to you and tell them a little bit about their roommate experiences, just briefly, if they currently live with roommates, how many roommates they've had, things like that. And I'll start with Michael.
Hi, I'm Michael. I currently live in New York with two roommates. Over the course of my lifetime, I've lived with, 7 or 8 different people in various living situations, from shared room roommates to suite mates and like apartment living situations. So all of them have been fairly positive. So I really am here to provide the positive aspect of roommate living.
Thank you. And Amy?
Yes, hi. My name is Amy. I currently live in Fort Collins, Colorado. I actually live by myself these days, but have had many experiences with roommates over the years, and lots of different situations. I've lived with one other person. I've lived with 4 other people. I've lived with friends. I've lived with random people I met off the internet. So plenty of mixed experiences, and happy to answer any of y'all's questions today.
And Davis, if you'd introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Davis. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. So the first time I had 3 random roommates. That was in college. And then after that, or like the next year, I had 2 roommates, and they were like friends of mine that I met in school. And then now I have just 1 roommate who I went to high school with. I didn't know them in high school, but I kind of remember them from high school. And that's why I just have 1 roommate now.
All right. Basically, I'm going to go around and just sort of ask you all the same series of questions, and I will randomly pick people to start. So Davis, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. Aside from family or a significant other, when's the first time you had a roommate, and did you get to choose them or were they assigned?
So I'm assuming we're not including like Boy Scout stuff when I was a Boy Scout, but I'll say that was college. I did not get to pick. I think you could if you wanted to, but I didn't have any friends that were going to the same school as me at the time, so it was just random. So that's when I had the 3 random roommates.
Okay. Now, the 3 roommates, did any of you actually share a room, or did you each have a room and like have a communal living space?
Yeah, so luckily I had my own room. So it was 4 people total, and there were 2 bathrooms.
Okay.
So me and another person shared a bathroom, but we all shared like the same kitchen and like living area.
Okay. Amy, what about you?
The first time I lived with roommates that wasn't at home. It was definitely when I went to college, was the first time, and we shared a room. Well, I had a roommate, we shared a room, and then we had a suite that connected with a bathroom. So we actually shared a bathroom with 2 other people. So kind of had like 3 roommates almost. And yeah, that was kind of my first experience. I didn't get to choose any of them. It was, we had the option, and I did go to college with actually one of my best friends, and we had talked about moving in together, or at choosing to be in a dorm room together, but just decided that to make new friends and to sort of like branch out and like maybe save our friendship, we decided to not be roommates together, which I do think ultimately was a good decision, although we did live together later in life. But overall, it was a good experience. I think sharing a room, it's definitely can be a lot of negotiation, but I think that just comes with the territory of starting college. So.
Okay, I'm definitely going to get back to you on the negotiating part. Michael, what about you?
My first roommate experience was also my freshman year of college. I did share a room, but I also lived on a floor so our bathroom situation was there were 25 of us sharing one bathroom. It was like a 2-shower, 2-stall bathroom. It was definitely a lot. But it was well maintained. Like there was a full-time janitorial staff that like maintained it very well. So that also did help things. It's not like it ever got super messy or anything, but it did definitely, there was a scheduling that you sort of had to figure out as you went, sort of everyone else's class schedule. So you knew like when the showers were going to be free or when the best time to brush your teeth was. So you weren't just like staring at with, standing in there with like 20 other boys. But yes, I agree. It's definitely some negotiations. I did get to pick my roommate. We did sort of this almost like a dating app type form thing where you could talk with a bunch of different people and sort of discuss where you wanted to live on campus and what type of living situation you wanted. So it actually, I think that did help my original living situation be very smooth and easy because we'd already sort of communicated what type of living situation we wanted to have before we actually moved in together, which was really nice. And then we actually got a little bit of a say in who we wanted to live with, even though I didn't know him.
Okay. Amy, I'm going to start with you. You talked about needing to negotiate, especially when you were living in a room together. What sort of conversations did you have when you first moved into the room together, and what conversations do you wish that you had had before you moved in with somebody?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the conversations we did have, like a big thing, at least for like my freshman year of college, was the bathroom situation, because we did share a bathroom with 2 other people and the doors locked on both sides. So like you would go in and have to lock both doors, but then people would forget to lock the door that wasn't their room. So you'd be locked out of the bathroom all the time. So we kind of came up with a system, like we all kind of got together and talked about like how like just making sure that we were keeping the door unlocked. And then also like we came up with a system of how to unlock the door in case someone did forget. And that was one of the conversations we did have. I think walking in, I like at least my freshman year of college, I think my roommate and I did pretty well. Like we did have conversations beforehand on like what we both were bringing, which I think was really helpful because, you know, you do have like a limited amount of space. And sometimes if you don't communicate about that, like at first you both are bringing all this stuff and then you have nowhere to put it. So I think that was a really good conversation to have. And a big conversation that everybody should have like before you move in with somebody, especially if like you have a small space like that and someone's like, hey, I'm bringing a coffee maker, or like, hey, I'm bringing this. It's always good to like make sure you have clear boundaries on what you're willing to let the other person share and what you're not, because that was definitely something that we ran into, was like people would bring stuff, but then it was like, can I use this or not? Or like, how often can you use that? So that's definitely something that I think we probably should have talked about. But I mean, it was, as we went along, we talked through that and it was fine. But yeah, so those were a couple of the conversations that were had.
Davis, same question. What conversations did you have with your roommates, and what conversations do you wish that you had had? You're muted, Davis. Thank you.
From college, I'm not sure if I can talk about it because it was some illegal activities that were happening inside of the dorm. Is that okay?
let's just talk about general conversations about living together that you wish that you'd had. As long as we're not bringing names into things, let's
Oh, no.
just tread a little carefully.
Yeah. It was like general things. I think it was just like keeping like the common area clean and like doing your dishes. I think that was like the main thing in college, at least. Now I didn't have too many. I don't think we actually had any conversation about like if you buy groceries or something, like what not to eat and what you can eat. It was sort of just like, if I didn't buy the groceries, I just don't eat the groceries. If I do buy them, that's what I eat. Yeah, so not too many conversations about that kind of thing, to be honest.
Okay. Michael, how about you? What conversations did you have and what conversations do you wish that you had had?
With my first roommate, like I said, we got pretty lucky because we had this sort of common application thing that really laid out like your preferences about when you wanted to go to bed, what kind of noise level you wanted to have, and then it matched you with people who had like similar interests and things. Like, do you want to go out on the weekends? Do you want to stay in? Like, how often were you going to bring people over? Things like that. So a lot of those conversations were sort of had through this application that just thrust us into it anyway. So we didn't actually have to have a lot of those conversations one-on-one, which was actually in some ways really nice. So for that experience, it definitely was it. But I agree that there's always the sort of shared space conversations of what's mine, what's yours, what's ours, like what are we both using, what are just I using, like if I buy snacks for this shared room, like can you have some? Are there certain snacks that are really just mine or versus just yours? So there's always like those conversations that I think you don't necessarily think about until someone's eaten like half of your Cheez-Its and you're like, oh, those were my Cheez-Its. But it was fine for them to eat like 4 of your Oreos. So it's definitely, there's always sort of that conversation of these are mine, like please don't eat these, but these are fine, as well as just sort of what it's like sharing a space, like how clean do you want to keep it? What are your expectations of like how often are you changing your sheets, things like that, like so they don't smell, that are just good to have, but also a lot of times I feel like don't necessarily come up until you're halfway through the living experience and you're like, Grant never cleans his sheets or always leaves his shoes out on the floor. And sometimes a lot of that is just you have to go along with it. And I feel like, yes, it would have been nicer to have some of those conversations earlier on, but I didn't know I was going to be annoyed by it until like halfway through, or vice versa. He didn't know he was going to be annoyed by it until like a month and a half in. So a lot of times I feel like things that happen as you move along that you sort of think about, you're like, oh, I need to have this conversation, because a lot of things that you think will annoy you probably won't, and a lot of things that you don't think will annoy you probably will. And I think it's just sort of one of those, as you move along, you'll figure it out.
I'm going to throw this question sort of out generally. You all have said that you lived with people that you didn't know or barely knew, and then you also lived with someone that you knew or were friends with. What is the difference in some of these conversations? Is it easier? Is it harder? What are your thoughts on that? And like I said, I'll throw that out to you all. Go ahead, Amy.
I would say personally, in my experience, I think it's actually been easier living with people I didn't know beforehand, only because I think when you do move in with a friend or somebody you already know, it adds this layer of like complications if you do run into issues or something, because it's just that much harder to like take your friendship outside of like just being roommates. So I think it's actually been better the times that I lived with like people I didn't know. Obviously, you run into the risk with that of, you know, you don't know somebody, so you're not really sure if you're going to jive or like how they live or things like that. But I think it's almost easier to have those conversations going in and saying like, what do you expect? What are my expectations? Things like that. And I think you can have that obviously with your friends, and you should if you are going to live with them. But I just think it's a little bit easier sometimes if you keep those relationships separate. Like I had a situation where I lived with a really good friend of mine once, but we also lived with her sister and then their best friend. And it just created this weird dynamic because like they were sisters, so they were always like sort of on each other's side. And so if there was like any issues that ever arose, it just sort of created this conflict. So sometimes I think if you don't have like emotional ties to someone you're living with, it's just a little bit better. And it's not that you can't, like, I've lived with people I also didn't know at all and then became really close friends with when we lived together. So I mean, obviously it's like a case by case basis, but in my experience, I think it's easier to live with people you don't know beforehand.
I would also agree with that. I think it sort of depends. I also would say I wouldn't live with like my best friend, but I actually currently live with someone I've known since college, and we've been good friends since college, but we weren't like super close friends. And I think that's also helped us because we didn't have this super strong emotional connection that Amy was talking about, where like things are awkward to discuss before and after. Like we've been friends, we knew each other, but it wasn't, we'd already spent a lot of time together, and we had to separate our emotions for like each other as people from our emotions as roommates. And so I will say that I also do think it's a little easier if you live with people that you're not necessarily like super close with. Like you can be close, but not as close as say a best friend or a sibling. I think those situations, it's really important that you know going in exactly where the boundary of like your friendship and your roommateship like starts and ends, so that those conversations can happen without you getting super uncomfortable or hurting their feelings and things. I know, for example, I lived with a different friend that I was pretty close with, and we just always annoyed each other a little bit when we were living together. It was never super dramatic or anything, but it was always like a little something where we just butted heads. We did not make good roommates, but we're really close friends. So as soon as we stopped living with each other again, like we got a lot closer in a different ways and things. So I think that also does help. Again, not being super close to the people you live with, maybe starting off. And like Amy said, I've definitely lived with people that I've grown super close with. For example, Amy and I actually lived together at one point, and we're like now very close friends. So that sort of happened organically and naturally, even though we had no idea who each other was when we moved in.
Davis, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'm on like the opposite end. I think it's easier to live with people you do know. Yeah, I just think if it's somebody I do know, I'm more comfortable just talking to them about certain things. I feel like I don't have to like beat around the bush about certain things. Like if one night I'm trying to go to sleep and they're playing music really loud or talking to somebody, like if it's a close friend or just a friend in general, I have no problem with going like, I guess in their room. Like if they're close enough, I could probably just go in their room. So like, hey, do you mind turning the music down? Trying to get some sleep. I have work tomorrow. But if it's a stranger, I might contemplate, let me just let them do what they're doing, and I'll just try to get to sleep, and hopefully they're not doing it for too much longer, that sort of thing. So like in cases like that, I think I prefer somebody that I know, but it's definitely case by case.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Now, as you've lived with different people, how did you handle some of the following things? How did you divide up cleaning duties? How did you discuss financial decisions, like who's going to pay the utilities versus, are you splitting them? Is one person paying the utilities, one person paying for groceries or something? Also things like keeping track of what belongs to whom. And then finally, sort of the awkward conversations of special guests that you might want to have over, things like that. How did you approach those conversations? And I'll start with Michael.
So as far as the financials have gone, I've always split them evenly with roommates. So things like utilities, rent, everything, it's always just been split evenly. I do know, because we've always had fairly similar living accommodations. So like no one's ever had a bigger, like a huge bedroom and someone else like a tiny room or something like that, where you might divide it up differently. So those conversations were always pretty easy going in, because it was, I'm going to pay my third or my half or my quarter or whatever of the utilities, and you'll pay the other part. They've always been in one person's name. So essentially they just send it out a Venmo request every month going, this is what our utility bill is. This is like your portion, just send it to me before this date. So it works out that way. But so those were always fairly easy. Things like guests and things, I think that's also sort of depends on the situation. So I think if it's a lot of times for like a single like night overnight guest or something that wasn't necessarily planned or something like that, a lot of times it's either a bit of a heads up. Like for example, when I was sharing rooms with people, there was usually some sort of heads up for that. In an apartment, it's usually just been there's been less of a heads up notification unless it's like a long-term thing. So anything that's like a couple days, I definitely, it's always, you know, nice to know that somebody's going to be in your house for a couple days so that if you do have an issue with it, you can mention it. But it's definitely one of those conversations that's good to have beforehand as well. Because for example, I had a roommate that I lived with who had different expectations of the amount of time that she could potentially have, like her boyfriend staying there, than the rest of the apartment felt. And so it was an important conversation that there was just some miscommunication in when we were looking for roommates. And so when it came time to it, it ended up being definitely a conversation that ended up resulting in her like moving out, just because we had a difference in what our expectations were of how often like a third person, like another person, would be spending time in our apartment and everything. So they're definitely good conversations to have, and they can get a little awkward and at times potentially a little heated because sometimes like there's emotions. And anytime I feel like you have conversations like that, sometimes I know from my experience, I'll come in being like, I have to win this argument, even though it's not really an argument. It's sort of a conversation about what's going to happen. And so it's definitely, I feel like good to have them over a course of time as well, for me especially, that so that you don't always come in with this I have to win this argument. You have time to like step back and be like, oh, this isn't like an argument that has to win, this is just how I'm feeling about it at that moment. And maybe if I think about it a little more, I'll realize I'm being ridiculous and insane, which I have on multiple occasions. And so it's definitely good, I feel like, in that sense to just sometimes step back from the situation as well, and like compose your thoughts and like set out, this is my like list of like what I want and what you want, let's find like a happy medium or decide. And sometimes it will come down to deciding that you just can't resolve that, and it is best that either one of you find somewhere else to live.
Davis, what are your thoughts?
This is about splitting like bills and things around the apartment or house or something like that.
Chores, bills, awkward conversations about company, things like that.
Yeah, so bills are split evenly every time. And so I live in an apartment where like the rooms are like the same. So there's like no weird math you have to do to figure out who has an extra square foot here or there, who pays an extra $20. It's nothing like that. So all the bills are split. Chores, I don't know if it's split. It's kind of just like whoever sees it kind of just does it. So if you see the trash is full, take it out. Dishes is a little weird because I think we kind of just do our own dishes. So like if I use it, I clean it. But sometimes like if it goes into the sink, that dish no longer exists anymore until I somehow remember that I use that dish. But yeah, I'll say for the most part, everything is split pretty evenly. And then like for guests, we kind of have like the same friend group. So it's like people just kind of come and it's normally okay. It's not like normally like a lot of strangers or anything. So it's like no big issues with that. But I think that's like a benefit of living with somebody you do know, especially somebody like in your own friend group.
Amy, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And like piggybacking off what Davis said, like, I think when you live with a friend, because I have lived with good friends before, and it's like that kind of stuff, it is a little different because you just have, like, especially for guests, it's just kind of like, you know, you just kind of have that already relationship built in. But I think like regardless, I mean, you all could have a different opinion, but like my thing has always been, regardless of if you're friends or if you're not, I think it's good to have like regular check-ins, just like with your roommates, to be like, hey, you know, let's talk about how things are going. Like that's a good time to just like bring up stuff where it's like, hey, I've actually been feeling this, or like if you feel like something's been going weird, you can reevaluate. Like if it's especially when you first move in, I think it's good to just like sync up with everybody and say like, okay, what are the expectations? Like who's going to clean what, who wants to like take over the bill for this and things like that, just so you all are on the same page, is something that I've always found is effective. Because I think sometimes too, like there can be things that come up that like might be annoying, but you just aren't really going to like bring it up to like cause a problem. But if you have like a time where you're like, okay, we're all going to check in on stuff, it like might make somebody feel more comfortable in bringing something up and like problem solving. So that's something that I have found effective in the past.
Great. Now, here's a question and follow up to that. Have any of you ever had a problem where one of your roommates wasn't meeting their financial obligation? They didn't pay their share of the rent or something like that, especially on a consistent basis? And what, if anything, did you have to do about that?
I luckily have never had any sort of like financial situation like that, where someone wasn't paying their rent, but we've definitely had issues in the past with like a chore wheel or something where like certain people weren't holding up necessarily their end of like the chores. I've also been the person not holding my end of the chores. And like Amy said, it's nice to have a regular check-in or at least have an established sense of bringing up things like that with each other and communicating those situations so that it doesn't become this like overwhelming issue for one roommate or two roommates or anything like that. It becomes a lot easier to bring it up if you're already communicating about things, so that when something like that does happen, you can bring it up to them and be like, hi, you're not cleaning the bathroom regularly like you're supposed to. And you can be like, oh my gosh, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry. Or if people aren't open to that, you can be like, well, we either need you to like take your share of the cleaning or hire someone to do it or like move out. Like again, they sometimes become awkward, but again, if you've already had like the open communication, I think it becomes a lot easier to do that. And like Amy said, if you're uncomfortable with situations like that, establishing sort of like a monthly roommate meeting or every couple months or something to like check in with each other, it becomes a lot easier to bring those things up without feeling like you're bringing it up out of the blue or anything. You already have like this sort of established line if the communication is something that you like struggle with or are uncomfortable with situations. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Davis, have you ever had a situation like that where you've had to deal with that?
I have not.
Lucky.
Luckily, yeah.
How about you, Amy?
I would say personally, I've never had to deal with that, but I have had friends who have. And I would say this is just if for some reason there's like you have a roommate that's not like, that's having like financially struggling, I think that, or, you know, is struggling to pay rent. I think those are really hard conversations to have because it's also like case by case basis, like why they're not like able to pay their rent. And I think if you are for some reason like at a point where you're getting notices from your landlord like, hey, we're gonna have to like evict you if you don't start like paying, it's just really good for you as the other roommate to just make sure you're in communication with your landlord about like the fact that you're paying your part of the rent, just so that they're aware that it's not on you and it's on this other person. Because at the end of the day, like it could affect you as well. And so you just want to be like in communication with your landlord on that. So it doesn't affect you as much, because like that can also affect you financially as well. It affects your credit score, things like that. So just keeping that in mind.
To that end, do you guys typically find some sort of written agreement between yourself and your roommates useful? Do you have them? If not, would you recommend them?
I mean, beyond a lease, no. I mean, I will say like I've been in situations where like I've been subletting, but like wasn't on the lease. And so I drew up like a written contract to say like I was on a month by month basis and X, Y, and Z, like that was the agreement. And then we all signed it. But that's been the only time that I've ever felt like a written agreement needed to be in place. I mean, I would say like unless you're really like concerned that somebody might take something. I'm not sure why else you would do that, but I think if you're on a lease, that's like legally binding. So yeah, those have really been the only times that I've ever had a written agreement, but I'm opening it up to the floor.
Yeah, I
Davis,
kind of
what are your
agree.
thoughts?
I agree. If they're not like, I don't say listening to the lease, but like if they're not adhering to those rules, like anything I draw up isn't going to make much difference, I don't think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've never been in a scenario where I thought something I write up would be like more security or anything.
And I was just even thinking also just sort of like an agreement on chores, anything like that. You typically just have those conversations. You've never really put that type of thing in writing.
Yeah, I've never tried it for chores. I mean, I'm pretty sure it might be useful, just so you don't have to think about who's doing this and who's doing that, especially for things like obviously dishes and trash. So I can see that being useful.
I can tell you I've had the same roommate for 30 years and he and I still both avoid looking at the trash or dishes. We're just like, what? They'll just disappear at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
agreements like Amy said, for people like subleasing from you, I think it is important to have some sort of written agreement stating the financials and stuff, so that you're clear on that and you're also clear about the term that they want to live there and things like that. So it's a little easier to lay out, and there's some security for both of you as well. So like they have some written form of financial obligation, as well as they have some security from you that you're not just going to kick them out or anything like that. So I think it is important, especially if you're not specifically on the lease, to make sure you do have some sort of documentation of your ability to be there, that they've talked to the landlord and they like potentially know you're there and things like that. So that if the landlord comes by and is like, well, there's only supposed to be 2 of you living in the apartment, you can be like, well, they said they talked to you, all of these things. And like you have, again, documentation of these things. And again, other documentation saying of their financial obligations as well to the apartment, that they're living there and are agreeing to pay their share of the utilities, the rent, etc. And then I've never personally had like a chore agreement, but I do know people that have had to like have drawn up written agreements with their roommates about chore wheels and stuff, where they were having issues with one roommate or 2 roommates not holding up their end of the chores, like taking out the trash, cleaning the bathroom, etc. And I think that again is sort of on a case-by-case basis. If it works for you, it works for you. I've never personally had to have that myself, but I do know some people that it's actually worked really well for, that they as sort of a, not even a legal thing, but just sort of a writing of, I need to be doing this at these times. So potentially if you forget easily or something, you can see that or remember that, and it sometimes help with stuff like that.
Okay, we do have a question from someone watching. They ask, what are your thoughts about getting an apartment versus living in a dorm? And also, how do you deal with a difficult roommate when you're in a dorm? It sounds like some of you have had sort of difficult experiences in dorms. So Davis, I'm going to start you with this question. Do you recommend an apartment or a dorm? And how do you deal with a difficult roommate if you're living in a dorm?
Yeah, it's kind of hard. I guess if you're in school, I think it depends. I'm leaning towards dorm just because I'm assuming it's like close to campus, and just being close to campus is normally easier. I think it's cheaper. I don't remember if when I lived on campus versus off campus, if it was cheaper, or which was cheaper and which was more expensive. Yeah, but besides like being like closer to campus, they're pretty similar, to be honest. Unless you're like at one of those strict schools that have like what is not the TAs, the RAs, I think is what it's called, who are like making sure you're not making too much noise, or like just all the rules that they have. So it's really pros and cons to both. I would say the most important thing is price, probably, whichever one is cheaper. And then do you have your own method of transportation? If not, probably a dorm is better than living off campus. But yeah, it's not really cut and dry, like which one is better, I don't think.
And what about dealing with a difficult roommate in a dorm?
That one's hard. You just have to talk to them, I guess. And if that doesn't work, I think you just have to hopefully get a new one. Like for dorms, it might be easier to like change rooms. I don't think that's possible for apartments. I think once you sign that lease, you're kind of locked in. But like if you have a difficult roommate like in a dorm and you talk to them and that doesn't work out, it might be possible to like get a new roommate or change rooms or something.
Okay, Amy?
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation, but I think like dorms, especially for your first year, if you can swing it. Again, financially, I'm not sure what is cheaper or not. I know at least like for me, it actually was more expensive to be in the dorms, but I think it's because you also get like all your meals and everything. Like part of the package is you do get like the dining hall access, so you're like paying for food on campus. But I would say like if you can swing that, like I would definitely at least your first year of school do the dorms. I think that's like a really cool experience and it's a great way to like meet people. I think that's like the biggest thing too. Just with going to college, like you meet new people and create a community, and there's like so many activities and stuff that they plan for you with inside the dorms and things like that I just think are really great for like your first year. That you wouldn't really have access to if you're like just living in an apartment off campus. And yeah, I mean, I think dealing with a difficult roommate that like in a dorm, yeah, it is a tough one. But also like to Davis's point about the RAs, like that's kind of one of the reasons they're there. So if you do have a problem, like they're there to support you and help mediate that situation as well. So like, I know I think I probably utilized my RA and that. And yeah, I mean, it is easier. You can change rooms. Like I know that happened to multiple people where they just like changed rooms because they couldn't be in the same space as another person. And I think the dorms are different just because you are sharing like a room with a person, which I think is a lot more to navigate than it is just an apartment, because at least you have your own space in apartments. Like you can go like if someone's really annoying you can just like go to your room and be like, fine, I don't have to talk to that person. But it's not really the same in the dorm. So yeah, it's just communication. And like if you really can't figure it out, don't worry about it. Like some people just don't get along and it happens, and you probably won't be the only one. And like, there's always options. Yeah.
Michael, what about you?
Yeah, so where I went to university, you were actually required to live in the dorms freshman year. Like all freshmen were required to live on campus. But I actually lived on campus all 4 years. I actually never moved off campus at the end of my schooling. And I think it was definitely nice for like all of the reasons that have been stated before. Like you had an on-campus dining hall. Even when I did live in an on-campus apartment, which I didn't have like a dining hall, like a meal plan or anything, but it was on campus. And so it was so much closer to everything than off-campus apartments were. And I will say that the dorms and the apartments on campus were more expensive, but only comparably to like the apartments that were significantly further away. So for me, like all of my classes were a 15-minute walk from my apartment, whereas all my friends who lived off campus, it took them about half an hour to 45 minutes to get there, especially if they were paying significantly less, just because they lived farther away to get a more affordable apartment. And so there's definitely pros and cons to that. I will say also all of the on-campus living options were significantly cleaner than like the cheaper apartments off campus, just because that was one of the things with like the cheaper apartments is they just didn't keep them up as well as other things. And that's not to say that there aren't like nice options off campus, but those were usually significantly more expensive than the on-campus options. So there's definitely pros and cons to both. And then as everyone else has said, I think the roommate situations do become significantly easier if you're living on campus, because there's sort of this already built-in network to move students around if they're having difficult situations and stuff and such. And you do have someone, especially in the dorms, living on your floor, helping you navigate those situations as well. So if you need sort of a third party like mediator, you have your RA there to help you and to offer guidance, even to help with an issue. So even if you don't need to change rooms or anything, you just need to like someone to help facilitate a discussion between you and your roommate. I actually know some people that the RA was able to help them avoid moving out from each other because they were able to like talk through whatever issues they were having and either solve them that way as well, which is definitely nice. You don't necessarily have those options when you're living in an apartment. You're responsible for facilitating those conversations. You can't necessarily ask a third person for help as easily. So there's definitely pros and cons, I think, to each, because you have less privacy in the dorms, but you also have more like options, and there's a lot more, like Amy said, there's activities and things that happen in the dorms a lot, which are, I mean, usually fun and a great way to also meet the other people living around you. You're muted.
Oh, you're mute.
Yep. We're about ready to wrap up, but I just wanted to give each of you sort of a last chance. If you have any fun horror stories that you want to share, or if you have any general advice that you'd like to share for new people moving out into the world and having their first experiences living with somebody not a family member. And Amy, we will do ladies first this time.
Sure. I would just say, the thing is, people are people. Sometimes you're going to have you might have some crazy roommate situation. We've all been there. I would say, if you're not living with somebody you don't know, make sure to vet as much as possible, as much as you can, ask those questions, and don't be afraid to be asking people what their living style is like, because at the end of the day, if you're living in a stressful living situation, it really sucks. So I would say just make sure that you're have a list of questions and have those conversations before you move in, just because you will regret not having certain conversations later, and it's just more annoying to have to deal with it afterwards. But yeah, and just make sure also, a big thing too that I think people don't think about as often is if you are looking into apartments, just make sure you're reading over lease agreements, things like that. Sometimes there's some weird stuff in leases. So just make sure that you're making sure you know what you're signing before you do it, because that can also be weird as well. But yeah, I think just make sure you're communicating and things should all be well.
Davis?
I'd say before you sign the lease, drive around the neighborhood, I guess, that you're going to be living in. And even if you're kind of familiar with the neighborhood, I don't know, look at a map or something, because the lease I'm in now, I was not aware, this is going to sound crazy, I was not aware that my building was directly adjacent to some train tracks, and it's freight trains. And I was made aware of this at I think it was the first night I was here. And I think we looked at these apartments twice, and the 2 times we came, the train never came by. And the first night I was here, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, the freight train rode by, and it did the horn. And it was so loud, I thought I was about to get run over. So yeah, definitely drive around your neighborhood, see what is there, so you're not surprised about if there's loud bars next door somewhere, or behind some trees or something. Just make sure you're aware of what's in your neighborhood.
That's actually really good advice. And Michael?
Yeah, I would say definitely make sure, if you can, tour the apartment as well. I know some people will move into things that without having seen it, or even if you personally can't, maybe you're moving or something, maybe you have a friend who lives there who can walk around and be sure. I think touring the apartments is always a good idea, because sometimes they look great in pictures, but then you get there and you realize it's just a fresh coat of paint and nothing else. So the walls are still leaking. And it's definitely nice to have that idea. And then also, I feel there are certain situations that you just can't prepare for. For example, I had a landlord who stopped taking her meds and thought I was spying on her for the federal government, and she kicked the entirety of the house that we were living in out of the house and then burned it down. And you can't really prepare for that. You sort of just have to figure that out as you go. And there will be situations, maybe not quite that crazy, but there's always going to be certain situations that you just can't prepare for, or you're never going to think of in advance. And again, having open communication, and then some sort of maybe support network near you, maybe somebody that you can call at 3 a.m. and cry because your landlady kicked you out. because you stop taking your meds is nice to have as well. Because you can personal experience that even if you get along with your roommates, it's nice to have someone who's not associated with them that you can like call and vent to about them. Because no matter what, somebody's gonna annoy. No matter how well you get along, like you're gonna get annoyed living with someone, and it's nice to have a third party that you can call and just like complain to about that. Sometimes it's nice. They're not actively involved and they can just be like, oh yeah, that does suck, or you're being an idiot. Like they're not being weird. I would recommend having a friend that you can complain to sometimes about your roommate.
And just one last thing, what do you like about living with a roommate? I know most of the time we have roommates for financial situations, but what's the nice thing about having a roommate? Michael?
Oh, I've actually always enjoyed having roommates. I think it's really fun living with people. You can do things like have friends over and like little parties that you're not solely responsible for preparing or setting up and things. And you also sort of have this, especially if you get along, you sort of have this built-in friend sometimes that you can just like hang out with in your living room and watch TV or play video games and or like make dinner with. My roommate now loves to cook and I absolutely hate cooking, and so she's always giving me like food, which is definitely a great perk if you have a roommate that loves to cook. But it's, yeah, there's always this sort of like fun things. And again, you also have someone to share the chore load with, so you're not the only person cleaning your kitchen or your bathroom. And you know, sometimes if you're having like a bad mental health week, you can be like, hi, I just like really can't this week, and like next week you'll take over the cleaning, but they'll like maybe cover you for you that week. So it's definitely nice to have that sort of built-in a way support system, especially if you get along really well. It's, you know, it's not just on you, and there is, you know, someone you can vent to about working from home. It's nice.
Davis?
Yeah, those same points. You just have somebody else to talk to in person. I think that's nice. Yeah, like a built-in friend. Yeah, really the same points.
Awesome. Amy, last but not least.
I mean, as I live alone now, as somebody who has had roommates for a long time and now live alone, I mean, there's obviously pros and cons to both, but I do miss, there is just this like built-in like community aspect almost of like living with roommates. Like if you're ever just like, I don't have plans tonight and your roommate doesn't either, you can like do stuff together. And there is just this like, yeah, especially if you get along with your roommates, it can be a little bit more fun than living by yourself. But yeah, just like the fun aspect of having people around is nice.
I want to thank you all so very much for taking your time to talk to everybody, and we will stop it here for now. Thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you all for joining us.